take off your purity rings because we're about to get naughty. There are countless websites, articles, YouTube channels, Instagram accounts that are dedicated to purity culture, and most of them are about the side of women. Because for women, it is particularly difficult. I don't see many videos, articles, any of that about men. And some of the ones that I've seen have been written by women. Men who grew up in the purity culture environment, it's difficult for them to open up and be vulnerable about their sexuality. But also, for men particularly, there's this intertwining connection between the ideas of purity and masculinity. Purity culture. It sounds strange. I'm not going to go into a step-by-step detailed explanation on the history of purity culture. There are many YouTube videos. I will leave references down below. But basically, it's an evangelical Christian principle that is founded upon the idea of outside of marriage, there can be no sex or sexual action at all. Sex, therefore, is only permissible between a man and a woman in a sacred union of matrimony recognized by God for the sole purpose of procreation. All actions outside of those parameters or preventing those conclusions, babies, is strictly prohibited. So many of my Christian viewers will say, yeah, that makes complete sense to me. Purity culture is not just the principle, it's the obsession. Do I think adolescents are overly sexualized in culture nowadays? Yes. Do I think that maybe teaching self-control and respect is something that is lacking? Yes. And is abstinence before marriage something that I think is good in certain circumstances for certain people? Sure. Why not? But what happens in this purity culture environment when you have this obsession of purity? What are the effects on normal people? So before even reaching puberty, there's this idea that you're gonna start feeling these feelings and they're gonna be bad and you shouldn't act upon them. So there's this mysterious thing that's gonna happen in your life and you're afraid that if you're not prepared, then maybe you'll fall and be disgraced in the eyes of God. So there's this denial of the natural movements of the body, and it's seen as something evil and bad that you have to reject even before it happens. And because sexual feelings and thoughts for an adolescent is constant, the idea of purity and the emphasis of purity is something that is constantly reinforced by parents, by teachers, by the priests. I always thought it was interesting how much the priests talk about purity to the adolescents when they are older men in black dresses who have never supposedly had sex. When I was a priest, if you didn't know, I used to be a priest. I never focused on the rules. I never set strict guidelines. Like, boys, do this, don't do this. I never did that because I didn't want them to approach sexuality from a negative way, because in my past, sexuality was taught to me in such a twisted way that I knew that I had so many hang-ups because of it. And then, of course, because of that, you have awkward relationships between boys and girls, that boys don't understand girls because they never were exposed to them. And then you had the more rebellious boys who would go and talk to the girls, and they were always ostracized. They were the bad ones, the bad influences, the ones that the parents told their girls, watch out for that one. He's not being a good young man. He's not respecting the girl because he wants to be her friend. Why else would a boy talk to a girl unless he wanted to have sex with her? Stupid. It's funny because most of my friends before coming to that traditional group were girls. And then I was introduced with the idea of masculinity. The idea of masculinity was something that always came up when talking about purity, when talking about anything in relation to that subject. You could never really have a purely platonic relationship that was free of the danger of sin. So only when a young man was ready to be married, he had a job, he had stability in his life, and especially that he was a good Catholic. Then he could look for a girl who was also a good Catholic, who was pure, who was at the age to be married, I hope. And then they could start seeing each other, but all in the perspective of marriage. That's the end goal. And that was being a man. Gosh, there's so much to say about this. Everything, there's so many connections, all that can find their center in the purity culture. And as I'm talking about it, I'm seeing more and more connections. So I want to try to keep this very simple and succinct. So there was a connection that was made between purity and godliness and impurity and sin. The more that you were involved in sins, actions that were against purity, the farther away you were from God, and the more earthly, the more dirty you were. There was a direct correlation between the ideal of purity culture and where I saw myself as a normal adolescent boy, and how they weren't connected. And again, with the masculinity thing, I saw myself as less of a man, because in my eyes, the ideal, not only the ideal of the purity culture, but also the Catholic ideal, was a man of God. And in this environment that I was brought up in, there were these examples, apparent examples, of men of God. And it's funny because I could never see them committing the same acts that I was committing. Because I connected godliness to purity, I saw them as better people. I saw them as stronger Catholics, as real men, and not myself. Only later on did I realize that men are men. Whether you're a priest, a father, everybody is a man, and I was not alone. Although there's so much more I can say on this subject, and I hopefully will, little by little, maybe in my Instagram and Facebook posts, I want to tell you that sex is not everything. I'll leave you with a little anecdote. Purity, and especially virginity, was something essential when talking about the priesthood. Remember, I used to be a priest. I had struggled with masturbation for so long. I was committed to turn my life around and to finally become faithful. Because remember, being a good Catholic in my mind was related to being pure. Well, one day during class, we were studying virginity. That was one thing that I had in my head. At least I'm a virgin. At least I have that going for me. And looking at the definition of virginity, I found out that because I had masturbated, technically, I was no longer a virgin. When I found out that I was no longer a virgin in their eyes, I felt like a disgusting piece of shit. Anyway, there's so much I can talk about in this subject, so I want you to flood the comments with your observations, maybe your experiences, but please, in a very general way, nothing specific, because your comments might be a temptation for people who are trying to remain pure. So have respect. Please stay pure.